The rain fell hard on the small town of Collinsville, Pennsylvania, that November morning. Streets that had once lined up to welcome parades now sat empty. The American flags on the porches of Elm Street hung limp in the gray, cold air. Sarah Mitchell sat in her mother's living room, staring at a photograph on the mantelpiece. It was her younger brother, Tommy, in his army dress uniform, smiling at the camera with that same crooked grin he'd had since childhood. He'd been gone for 3 years now. 3 years since they'd buried an empty casket. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for her coffee, but she didn't drink it. She just held the warm cup, trying to feel something other than the numbness that had become her constant companion. The clock on the wall ticked past 9 in the morning. Another day in a life that didn't feel like living anymore. Her mother, Margaret, came down the stairs slowly. She was 72 now, her hair completely white, her face lined with the kind of grief that no amount of sleep could ease. She didn't say anything. She just sat next to Sarah and took her hand. They had learned long ago that sometimes words only made things worse. But this morning was different. This morning, something would change everything. Sarah Mitchell hadn't always been the woman sitting in this dark living room. 23 years ago, she'd been born in Collinsville, the eldest of 2 children. Her father, Michael, had been a police officer. Her mother had been a nurse. They were good people, hardworking people, and they'd raised their children with strong values. Serve others, tell the truth, protect those who can't protect themselves. Sarah had taken those lessons to heart. Too much, maybe. When she turned 18, she'd enlisted in the army. Not because her father pushed her. Not because she had anything to prove. She'd enlisted because she believed in something larger than herself. She believed in the idea that some people needed to stand watch so that others could sleep safely in their beds. For 8 years, she'd been a combat air support controller attached to the 31st Fighter Wing. It was specialized work, dangerous work. She coordinated airstrikes, talked pilots through combat situations, and made the kinds of decisions that meant the difference between soldiers coming home and families getting notifications at their doors. She was good at her job, really good. But nobody in Collinsville cared about that. What they cared about was that she was a woman doing a man's job. What they cared about was the way she walked into the American Legion Hall and saw the looks. What they cared about was making sure she knew she didn't belong. Sarah's father had passed away 5 years ago before she'd deployed to Afghanistan. A heart attack, sudden and unexpected. She'd been at the funeral for exactly 48 hours before flying back to base. She couldn't afford to grieve. Not then. There were missions to fly, lives depending on her to do her job perfectly. But Afghanistan had changed her. Combat did that to everyone, though nobody liked to talk about it. The sounds stayed with you. The weight of decisions stayed with you. The faces of people you couldn't save stayed with you. Sarah had made it through her second deployment. Then came the third in a different region, working with different units, but the same essential mission. Keep the soldiers on the ground alive, make the hard calls, do the job. That's when everything fell apart. It happened on a Tuesday morning, March 15, 2021. Sarah could still tell you the exact temperature, the exact light in the sky, the exact words that were said over the radio. Combat did that to you too. It burned certain moments into your memory with perfect clarity. A patrol from the 87th Infantry had been pinned down outside a village. Taliban fighters had them surrounded. The soldiers were calling for air support, and Sarah was the one coordinating the response. There was an F-16 in the area, piloted by Major James Harmon, a decorated officer with 12 years of service and over 200 combat missions under his belt. Sarah had worked with Harmon before. He was one of the good ones. Careful, precise, understood the weight of what they were doing. She'd given him the coordinates and he'd confirmed them twice. That was protocol. The airstrike had been called in. The soldiers on the ground were told to take cover, and then something went wrong. Later, the investigation would be complicated. Later, there would be questions about the coordinates, about the maps, about the communication. But in that moment, Sarah only knew that the explosion had gone off in the wrong place. It had gone off where a group of civilians had been sheltering from the fighting. It had gone off where it was never supposed to go. 23 people died, 15 of them were children. Sarah remembered the radio going silent. She remembered Harmon's voice, tight and controlled, asking her to confirm the coordinates. She remembered her own voice, steady as ice, confirming what she had given him. And she remembered the moment she realized that she had made a mistake. Not Harmon, not the maps, her Sarah Mitchell. The investigation had taken 3 months. In the end, they determined that the error had been on Sarah's part. She transposed two numbers in the coordinates. It was easy to do, the investigators said. It was a human error. It happened. The recommendation had been that Sarah would face military court. There would be charges. There would be a trial. But then something else happened, something convenient, something that made the whole problem go away. 2 weeks before the court-martial was scheduled to begin, Sarah had been on a routine supply run with 2 other soldiers. The convoy had been ambushed. The truck she was in had gone off the road, down an embankment. By the time the rescue teams arrived, Sarah and the other 2 soldiers were dead. Or so everyone believed. The army had held a ceremony. They'd presented her with medals posthumously. They'd given her a flag and called her a hero and said that she'd died serving her country. Her mother had received a notification, cold and official, telling her that her daughter had been killed in action, or KIA, just like the thousands of other families who'd received the same terrible news. But Sarah hadn't died in that crash. She'd survived, and she'd spent the last 2 years in a hospital in a remote part of the country recovering from injuries so severe that she barely recognized herself in the mirror. A fractured spine, a ruptured spleen, internal bleeding, degree burns on her left side. The doctors had told her she should never have survived the crash, the fact that she had felt like a mistake, like she wasn't supposed to be here anymore. They'd kept her in that hospital, in a specialized facility where she received care that wasn't supposed to exist, according to the official records. They'd kept her sedated for most of that first year. When she was finally awake enough to understand what had happened, they'd explained it to her in simple terms. She was dead. According to all the official records, Captain Sarah Mitchell had been killed in a vehicle accident. She had a military funeral. Her family had grieved. She'd been given medals she would never see, and she'd been erased. The Army officer who had explained it to her was a 3-star general named Richard Covington. He'd sat across from her hospital bed and told her that she'd been part of something called Operation Clean Slate. The real story of what had happened in the airstrike couldn't become public. The diplomatic ramifications would be too severe, but someone had to take the fall. She'd been selected, he said, because she was a woman. Because it would be easier to disappear a woman than a man, especially one without a strong family presence to push back. Because her court-martial would have been a public spectacle that the military wanted to avoid. So instead of a trial, she'd gotten a grave. Instead of consequences for her mistake, she'd gotten erasure. "We saved your life," Covington had told her, like she should be grateful. "In another scenario, you would have faced years in prison. Instead, you get a second chance. You get to disappear and build a new life." She'd spent the first 6 months after that conversation alternating between rage and despair. She'd tried to kill herself twice. They'd taken her off suicide watch after the second time because, technically, she didn't exist anymore. If she died now, it wouldn't matter. There would be no paperwork, no investigations, just another body that nobody would miss. But something had stopped her from trying again, something in her chest that refused to break completely. She'd survived in that truck. She'd survived the injuries. She'd survived all of it for a reason, and she was damned if she was going to let them win by taking her own life. Sarah had spent the next 18 months in physical therapy. She'd relearned how to walk. She'd endured surgeries and pain and despair. She'd watched the world move on through a television in her hospital room. She'd watched her family grieve. She'd watched her brother's empty casket be buried in the cemetery on the hill outside Collinsville. And she'd planned. 2 months ago, she'd finally been released from the hospital. They'd given her a new identity, new papers, and a monthly stipend that appeared in an account under a name that wasn't hers. They'd warned her that if she ever spoke about what had happened, about Operation Clean Slate, about the way the military had erased her to cover up a mistake, there would be consequences. She could live her life, they'd said. She could move forward. She could even go home as long as she didn't tell anyone the truth. Sarah had listened to all of it. She'd nodded and smiled and taken the documents. And then she'd gone back to Collinsville. She'd rented a small apartment above a pharmacy on Main Street, and she'd lived quietly for 2 months, watching her mother grieve a daughter who wasn't dead. This morning, though, everything was about to change. This morning, Sarah had received a phone call from a number she didn't recognize. The voice on the other end had been calm and professional and terrifying. The voice belonged to a journalist named David Chen, and he told Sarah something that had made her blood run cold. "I know who you are," Chen had said, "and I know what happened in Afghanistan. More importantly, I have documents. Thousands of pages of classified documents that prove that Major James Harmon wasn't responsible for that airstrike, that it was someone else, someone higher up in the chain of command, and I know why they made you disappear. Sarah's heart had been pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Don't say anything, Chen had continued. Don't confirm or deny. Just know that I'm meeting with sources at the Riverside Diner outside of town tonight at 7 o'clock. If you want to know the truth about what really happened, you should be there. The line had gone dead. Now, sitting in her mother's living room, Sarah looked at that photograph of her brother again. Tommy had joined the army because of her. He'd wanted to follow in his big sister's footsteps. He'd wanted to be proud of who he was. And he'd died thinking his sister was a failure, a woman who'd gotten people killed and then managed to get herself killed in the process. Sarah stood up slowly, her left side still aching, the scars still tight and painful. She kissed her mother on the forehead. Margaret didn't ask where she was going. She was still locked in her grief in a world where her daughter was gone. I'll be back soon, Sarah said. She meant it. Whether this journalist was real or a trap, whether this was the beginning of something or just another manipulation, Sarah was done hiding. The rain was still falling as she grabbed her jacket. Her hands were steady now, even though her heart still raced. She'd spent 2 years learning to live with pain, learning to survive when she wasn't supposed to survive. She'd spent 2 years learning how to be invisible. But tonight, Sarah Mitchell was going to stop being invisible. Tonight, the truth was going to start coming out. And there wasn't anything the army, or the government, or anyone else could do to stop her. The Riverside Diner sat on the edge of town, a place where the local road curved toward the highway that led away from Collinsville. It was the kind of diner that had been there for probably 40 years, with red vinyl booths, a long counter with swivel stools, and a jukebox in the corner that hadn't worked since the early 2000s. The place smelled like coffee and fried food and memories. Sarah arrived at 6:45 p.m. She sat in a booth near the back, her eyes on the door. The diner was half full, mostly with people she didn't recognize. Truck drivers, maybe, salesmen passing through town, the kind of folks who didn't ask questions and wouldn't remember your face the next day. She ordered coffee from the waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes who didn't seem to notice anything unusual about a woman sitting alone in a booth, staring at the door. At exactly 7 o'clock, a man walked in. He was in his early 40s, Asian American, wearing a dark suit and carrying a leather briefcase. He looked around the diner and his eyes found Sarah immediately. He knew she would be here. He knew what she looked like. That meant he had resources, connections. That meant he wasn't just a random journalist with a story. David Chen slid into the booth across from her. He didn't smile. He didn't shake her hand. He just set the briefcase on the seat next to him and looked at her with an expression that was part pity, part anger, and part something else she couldn't identify. "You're surprised I found you," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm surprised about a lot of things," Sarah said. Her voice was quiet, measured. 2 years of learning to control her emotions had taught her how to keep her face neutral, no matter what was happening inside. "My name is David Chen. I'm an investigative journalist with the Washington Post. I've been working on a story about military corruption for the last 3 years, about how the Pentagon deals with inconvenient mistakes, about how they use people up and then throw them away when they're not useful anymore." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. He set it on the table between them. "That's a copy of documents I've obtained from a confidential source inside the Department of Defense. They detail Operation Clean Slate, a program designed to cover up military mistakes by making the people responsible for them disappear. Your case is one of 5 in the last decade where this has happened." Sarah didn't touch the folder. She looked at Chen instead, trying to figure out what he wanted. Every person wanted something. That was the first lesson they'd taught her in the army. When dealing with people, figure out what they want and you figure out how to use them. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because I have a responsibility to tell the truth," Chen said. "Because what happened to you is a betrayal of everything the military is supposed to stand for, and because I need your help to prove it." Sarah laughed. It was a bitter sound, like glass breaking. "I'm nobody. I don't exist. Whatever I say, they'll just deny it. They'll say I'm unstable, that I'm making things up, that I'm the woman who got people killed and who's now looking for revenge." "You're right," Chen said. "That's exactly what they'll say, which is why we need more than just your testimony. We need documentation. We need you to help me identify the officers involved. We need you to help me connect the dots." He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "I have 6 months, maybe a year, before the statute of limitations runs out on some of these things. After that, nobody can be prosecuted. After that, they get away with it completely." Sarah picked up her coffee cup and took a sip. It was already getting cold. "Who's your source inside the Pentagon?" she asked. "I can't tell you that," Chen said. "You know I can't." "Then how do I know you're not working for them? How do I know this isn't a trap?" It was a fair question. Chen seemed to understand that. He nodded slowly and then did something unexpected. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. He unlocked it and slid it across the table to her. "Look at the emails," he said. "Look at the documents attached to them. Verify them yourself through the military's own databases if you want. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to look at the evidence and decide what the truth is." Sarah picked up the phone. What she saw made her blood run cold. There were emails from officers she recognized. General Covington was in several of them, discussing Operation Clean Slate with military prosecutors. There were budget documents that showed the program was funded through black budget appropriations that didn't appear in any official Defense Department filings. There were files listing the names of 5 soldiers who had been disappeared over the last decade. Her name was at the bottom of the list. And there, attached to one of the emails, was a memo from a high-ranking officer at the Pentagon to the director of the FBI. The memo was dated 3 weeks ago. It discussed the possibility of an investigation into Operation Clean Slate and outlined a strategy for countering any negative publicity about the program. The strategy was simple: discredit anyone who came forward with information about it, mark them as unstable, suggest they had a history of mental health issues. If necessary, suggest they'd made up the entire story out of a desire for attention and revenge. Sarah handed the phone back to Chen. Her hands were shaking slightly, but she kept her voice steady. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. "I need you to go on record," Chen said. "I need you to tell me everything that happened, everything you remember about that day in Afghanistan, about what the coordinates actually were, about how the mistake happened. I need you to explain how General Covington found you in that hospital and made you an offer you couldn't refuse." "And then," Sarah asked. "And then we publish," Chen said. "We publish the story and we publish the documents to back it up. We name names. We show the world what this program is and we make it impossible for them to deny." "They'll come after me," Sarah said. "Probably," Chen admitted. "They'll deny everything. They'll attack your credibility. They might even try to have you arrested for disclosing classified information. But they won't be able to make you disappear again, not completely, not when the whole world is watching." Sarah looked out the window of the diner. She could see Main Street of Collinsville beyond the glass. She could see the lights from the other businesses, the church steeple in the distance, the houses on the hill where she'd grown up. She thought about her mother grieving in that living room. She thought about her brother, Tommy, who joined the army because of her, who died thinking she was a failure. And she thought about all the other families, all the other soldiers who'd been erased, all the people who would never know the truth about what had happened to their loved ones. "Tell me what you need," Sarah said. "I'll tell you everything." Over the next 3 hours, Sarah told Chen everything. She walked him through that day in Afghanistan, minute by minute. She explained the coordinates, how she'd made the mistake, how she'd realized it immediately after the airstrike. She talked about the investigation, about how the army had determined her fault but kept it quiet. She talked about the ambush that wasn't supposed to happen, about waking up in a hospital bed and being told she was dead. She talked about General Covington and the offer. She talked about the medication they'd given her, keeping her sedated for months. She talked about the physical therapy and the pain and the slow realization that her life as she'd known it was over. And she talked about her family. She talked about her mother's grief, about her brother joining the army because of her, about coming back to Collinsville as a ghost and watching her mother age overnight. Chen took notes the entire time. His face was a mask of professional distance, but Sarah could see the anger underneath it. This was why he did this work, she realized. This was why he'd spent 3 years digging through classified documents and protecting sources and working on a story that might never see the light of day. Because somewhere inside him, he believed that the truth mattered more than anything else. "Thank you," he said when Sarah had finally finished. "I know this couldn't have been easy." "It wasn't," Sarah said, "but it needed to be done." I have to ask, Chen said carefully. What about the civilian casualties? Do you blame yourself for that? Sarah had asked herself that question 1,000 times, 1,000 different ways. And the answer had changed depending on the day, depending on how much pain she was in, depending on whether she was thinking clearly or not. I made a mistake, Sarah said finally. A serious mistake, and people died because of it. I have to live with that for the rest of my life. But I didn't make that mistake alone. I made it in a system designed to make mistakes. I made it in a situation where information was unclear and communications were imperfect, and we were all making decisions in chaos. If anyone else had checked those coordinates, if there had been proper verification procedures, those people would still be alive. She paused, and I definitely didn't deserve to be disappeared for it. I didn't deserve to have my life erased so that someone higher up in the chain of command could keep their career intact. Chen nodded. We'll need to talk to Major Harmon, he said. See if we can get him to go on record about what happened. That'll strengthen the story significantly. He won't do it, Sarah said. Not voluntarily. They'll have threatened him same way they threatened me. He'll be worried about his career, about his family. Maybe, Chen said, but we're going to ask anyway, and we're going to show him the documents. We're going to show him that he was being used as a scapegoat too. Maybe that will be enough. They left the diner separately, about 10 minutes apart. Sarah drove around Collinsville for a while, circling through neighborhoods she hadn't visited since she was a kid. She drove past her old high school. She drove past the cemetery where they'd buried Tommy. She drove past the church where her father's funeral had been held. When she got back to her apartment, there was a package sitting on her doorstep. It was plain, no return address, but it was clearly for her. She took it inside and opened it carefully. Inside was a letter. The letterhead was from the Pentagon. The signature at the bottom was General Richard Covington. The letter was brief. It said that Sarah's presence in Collinsville had been noted. It said that spreading classified information would be considered treason. It said that if she cooperated with any journalists or media organizations, the military would have no choice but to press charges. It reminded her that she'd signed non-disclosure agreements that were binding. And it ended with a sentence that made Sarah's blood run cold. We kept you alive when we didn't have to. Remember that. Sarah read the letter 3 times. Then she took a photograph of it with her phone and sent it to David Chen. Within an hour, she received a text message back. Perfect. This just made our story even stronger. Sarah set the letter aside and sat down in her small apartment. Outside, Collinsville was quiet, dark, peaceful, but inside something had shifted. The game had changed. They'd shown their hand. They'd revealed that they were desperate enough to threaten her directly. Which meant they were afraid. And if they were afraid, that meant something was coming, something they couldn't control, something that might finally bring the truth to light. Sarah didn't sleep that night. She sat in the dark and waited, wondering what would happen next. 2 weeks later, David Chen met with Major James Harmon at a coffee shop in Arlington, Virginia. Sarah wasn't there for the meeting, but Chen kept her updated by secure phone every step of the way. What had happened was surprising and complicated. Harmon had initially refused to talk. That was what Sarah had predicted. But when Chen had shown him the documents, when he'd explained about Operation Clean Slate, something had broken inside the Major. He'd sat in that coffee shop and cried for the first time in 2 years. I knew something was wrong, Harmon had told Chen. I knew they were lying to me about what happened, but I couldn't prove it. And I had a family, a career, a mortgage. I couldn't afford to be the one who rocked the boat, so I kept quiet. And I let them blame it on me, at least in private, and I lived with that. Harmon had agreed to go on record. More than that, he'd agreed to help Chen trace the orders that had come down from the Pentagon. He'd agreed to name names and provide documentation of his own. But within 24 hours of that meeting, something had happened that changed everything. Harmon's house had been broken into. Nothing had been stolen, but things had been moved around, disturbed. His computer had been accessed. Documents he'd been keeping in a safe had been photographed. It was a message. It was a threat. 2 days later, Harmon had called Chen and told him that he couldn't do the interview. He was sorry, but he'd been contacted by the military legal office, and they'd made it clear that any public statements would result in immediate court-martial. He had to think about his family. He had to think about his future. Sarah heard the news and felt something dark settle in her chest. This was how the system worked. This was how they kept people quiet. They threatened you, and if that didn't work, they threatened the people you loved. They made the cost of speaking the truth so high that most people couldn't afford to pay it. But Sarah had already paid the highest cost. They'd already taken everything from her. What else could they take? That's when Chen had called with the real bombshell news. The story was going to be published in the Washington Post in 48 hours. It was going to be on the front page of the Sunday edition. They'd verified all the documents. They'd confirmed everything Sarah had told them. They had testimony from 2 military lawyers who'd been part of Operation Clean Slate and were willing to speak on the record. They're going to come after you hard, Chen had warned. Once this story goes public, they'll go into full damage control mode. They might try to have you arrested. They might come after your mother. They might do things that are technically legal but definitely unethical. Are you ready for that? No, Sarah had said, but I'm doing it anyway. The Washington Post story ran on Sunday morning. The headline took up most of the front page. Operation Clean Slate, how the military erased 5 soldiers to cover up mistakes. The article told the story of Sarah's case, but it also told the stories of 4 other soldiers who'd been disappeared over the last decade. There was a specialist who'd accidentally leaked intelligence to the wrong people. There was a sergeant whose unit had engaged civilians in a questionable firefight. There was a technician who'd failed to maintain equipment properly, leading to a malfunction that killed 2 soldiers. And there was a pilot who'd made a targeting error during a bombing run. All 5 had been disappeared. All 5 had been officially marked as KIA or missing in action. All 5 had been given fake graves while their families grieved. The article included the documents that Chen had obtained. It included the testimony of the 2 military lawyers. It included quotes from military ethics experts saying that what had happened was a violation of military law and civilian law. It included damning emails from General Covington and other officers discussing how to make people disappear and how to keep the program secret. By Monday morning, the story was everywhere. Every news outlet in the country was running with it. Cable news was having panels about it. Social media was exploding. The Pentagon was being forced to issue statement after statement, all of which sounded increasingly desperate and unconvincing. On Tuesday, Sarah's mother called her. "Sarah, I know everything," Margaret said. Her voice was shaking. "I know you're alive. The news is showing your photograph from when you were in the army and they're talking about you, and I can't." Sarah drove to her mother's house immediately. When she walked through the door, Margaret was sitting in that same chair in that same living room, but everything had changed. Her mother wasn't grieving anymore. She was in shock, then anger, then joy, then confusion, cycling through emotions so fast she could barely speak. They held each other for a long time without saying anything. Sometimes words weren't necessary. Sometimes just being there was enough. "I'm sorry," Sarah said finally. "I'm sorry I couldn't tell you. I'm sorry you had to find out this way." "Don't apologize," Margaret said fiercely. "Don't you dare apologize. You're alive. My daughter is alive, and she did something brave, and I'm so proud of you I can barely stand it." The next few days were surreal. Sarah's face was all over the news. She was being called a hero and a whistleblower and a threat to national security, depending on which outlet you watched. The military was trying desperately to get ahead of the narrative, but they were losing badly. Congress was demanding an investigation. The Justice Department was opening a criminal probe. General Covington had resigned within 48 hours of the story breaking. He'd claimed it was for personal reasons, but nobody believed him. There were already rumors that he'd be facing criminal charges. But the military and the government weren't giving up. They were just changing tactics. 3 weeks after the story broke, Sarah received a visit from 2 FBI agents. They showed up at her apartment with a warrant and informed her that she was being investigated for violating the Espionage Act by disclosing classified information to the press. "This is ridiculous," Sarah said. "The information I disclosed was being used to cover up crimes. It was being used to hide the truth from the American people." "That may be," one of the agents said. His name was Thompson, and he didn't look happy about being there. "But the law is the law. You signed agreements. You disclosed classified material. Those are the facts." Sarah was arrested, processed, and released on bail within 24 hours. Her lawyer, a fiery woman named Patricia Ortiz who'd been recommended by the Washington Post's legal team, immediately filed motions to have the charges dismissed based on the public interest exception. The case would go to trial, but that wouldn't happen for months. In the meantime, Sarah's story had become even bigger. Now she was a potential martyr. She was a woman who'd tried to tell the truth and was being prosecuted for it by the same government she'd served. The narrative was powerful and compelling, and it played perfectly into the ongoing political arguments about government transparency and accountability. Senator Michael Harrison, a Republican from Pennsylvania, had taken up Sarah's case. He was calling for hearings. He was demanding investigations. He was using Sarah's story to push for broader reforms to military accountability and whistleblower protections. News networks wanted to interview her. Book publishers wanted to write about her. Documentary filmmakers wanted to follow her story. Sarah had become the face of military corruption, whether she wanted to be or not. But with all the attention came danger. The threats started arriving in the mail. Packages with no return addresses that contained things designed to terrify her. Images of her apartment building with red X's marked on her windows. Photographs of her mother's house with messages written on the back. Someone slashed her car tires one night. Someone left threatening notes on her car door another night. Sarah's lawyer had urged her to leave town, to go somewhere safe where the military and its sympathizers couldn't find her. But Sarah had refused. "If I run," she'd told Patricia, "then they've won. Then they've made me disappear again, just in a different way. I'm staying, and if something happens to me, at least everyone will know why." It was brave, Patricia had said, or foolish, maybe both. Sarah had started sleeping with a loaded pistol on her nightstand. She'd started taking different routes to the places she needed to go. She'd started paying attention to every car that seemed to follow her, every person who seemed to be watching. 1 month after the initial story broke, David Chen had come back to Collinsville. He wanted to interview Sarah again, to follow up with the story, to explain what was happening now with the investigation and the criminal charges. They met at the same diner in the same booth. The waitress recognized Sarah this time and gave her a subtle nod of approval. Sarah was no longer a stranger to Collinsville. She was a local hero now, a woman who'd fought the government and lived to tell about it. "The military is getting desperate," Chen told her. "They're starting to leak stories to friendly media outlets trying to discredit you. They're saying you were mentally unstable, that you had a breakdown, that you're an unreliable narrator of your own story. They're going to keep pushing that line as hard as they can." "Let them," Sarah said. "The documents speak for themselves." "They do," Chen agreed. "But documents don't sway people the way stories do. People believe what they want to believe, and some people really want to believe that the military is acting in good faith, that it's an institution worthy of trust. Those people will grab onto any reason to doubt you." Sarah knew he was right. She'd already seen the way some news outlets were treating the story differently. The conservative outlets were much more sympathetic to the military's version of events. Some were starting to suggest that Sarah was a disgruntled soldier looking for attention and revenge. "There's something else," Chen said, leaning forward. "The 2 lawyers who spoke to me on the record about Operation Clean Slate, they're both recanting their statements. They're saying they were coerced into talking to me. They're saying that the documents I have are fakes." Sarah's stomach sank. "Can they do that?" "They can do whatever they want," Chen said. "Will it hold up in court? No, but it doesn't matter if it holds up in court. It matters what people believe. And if people start doubting the evidence, if people start thinking there's doubt on both sides, then the military starts looking like it's not quite so clearly guilty of everything we're accusing them of." Sarah sat back in the booth. She'd known this would happen. She'd known the military wouldn't just roll over and accept that they'd been caught doing something illegal. But knowing it and experiencing it were 2 different things. "So what do we do?" she asked. "We find Major Harmon again," Chen said. "We convince him to go public despite the threats, or we find someone else who was part of the program. We find someone who's willing to risk everything to tell the truth." Sarah nodded slowly, and then she had an idea that was either brilliant or suicidal. She wasn't quite sure which. "I know someone," Sarah said. "Someone who might be willing to talk, someone who has everything to lose and maybe one last reason to tell the truth." General Richard Covington had resigned from the military but hadn't disappeared. He'd retreated to a private compound in rural Colorado, a place he'd purchased years ago as his retirement retreat. He was technically under investigation for his role in Operation Clean Slate, but so far, no charges had been filed against him. According to the financial records that Chen had managed to access, Covington was being represented by some of the most expensive lawyers in Washington. They were building a defense based on the argument that Covington had been acting under orders from superiors, and that he had no knowledge of the program's full extent. It was a lie. Everyone knew it was a lie. But in the military and government, lies had a way of becoming accepted truths if they were told by the right people in the right way. Sarah's plan was simple and dangerous. She was going to go talk to Covington herself. She was going to confront him and try to convince him to tell the truth. Chen had thought she was insane when she first brought up the idea. "He's going to call the police," Chen had said. "He's going to call his lawyers. He's going to have you arrested for trespassing or harassment." "Maybe," Sarah said, "but maybe he won't. Maybe somewhere underneath all that military bearing and bureaucratic maneuvering, there's a part of him that's tired of lying. Maybe he's having nightmares about what he did. Maybe he wants to tell the truth but doesn't know how." "That's a lot of maybes," Chen said. "I know," Sarah replied, "but it's worth trying, because right now we're losing the narrative. The military is winning in the court of public opinion. We need something dramatic. We need something that changes the game." And so, on a cold December morning, Sarah had driven to Colorado. The compound was more impressive than she'd expected. It sat on hundreds of acres of private land, with a long driveway and high gates. Sarah had called ahead, knowing that just showing up would probably get her shot by security. She told Covington's secretary that she was a former soldier who needed to speak to the general about a personal matter. She'd half expected to be turned away, but something had made the secretary agree to pass along the message, and something had made Covington agree to see her. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was arrogance, maybe it was something else. The general was waiting for her in a large study overlooking a valley full of mountains and forest. He looked older than she remembered. The stress of the last few weeks had aged him considerably. His hair had gone from mostly black to mostly gray. His face had deep lines that hadn't been there the last time she'd seen him. "Captain Mitchell," Covington said, not getting up. "Or should I call you by your new name? I can never remember what we decided to call you." "Sarah is fine," Sarah said calmly. She remained standing. She didn't take the seat he gestured to. "I'm not supposed to talk to you," Covington continued. "My lawyers have told me that any communication with you could be used against me. So this is a courtesy conversation between two people who served their country, a private conversation that won't be repeated anywhere." "I'm not here to trick you," Sarah said. "I'm here to give you a chance to do the right thing." Covington laughed. It was a harsh, bitter sound. "The right thing? Sarah, the right thing would have been never to make a mistake in Afghanistan. The right thing would have been for you to die in that car crash like you were supposed to. The right thing would have been for me to never get involved in the first place." "Maybe," Sarah said, "but you can't change the past. You can only change what happens next. You can keep lying and keep letting people think you were just following orders, or you can tell the truth." "The truth," Covington stood up now, agitation clear in his movements. "The truth is complicated. The truth is that we were all trying to solve an impossible problem. We had a soldier who made a catastrophic mistake. We had families who needed answers. We had a military institution that couldn't afford a major scandal. We all had a role to play." "We didn't," Sarah said. "Some of us had a choice and we made the right one. I chose to tell the truth. David Chen chose to seek out the truth, but you chose to cover it up. You chose to erase me. You chose to let other soldiers be disappeared so that you could protect your career." Covington was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, more controlled. "If I go public with the truth, my career is over. My family will be destroyed. My wife will leave me. My children will hate me. I'll probably spend the next 10 years in prison. And what do I get in return? A clear conscience? Is that really worth all of that?" "I don't know," Sarah said honestly. "I made the choice to tell the truth, and my life has been destroyed too. I'm facing criminal charges. I'm getting threatening letters. I'm living in fear, but I can sleep at night. I can look my mother in the eye. I can look at myself in the mirror. That's worth something, isn't it?" Covington walked to the window and looked out at the mountains. "You were a good soldier," he said quietly. "That's why I chose you, you know. I went through hundreds of files looking for someone who was isolated, who didn't have strong family connections, who wouldn't have a lot of people fighting to protect them. But I also wanted someone who was actually responsible for the mistake. I didn't want to pin this on some innocent person." He turned back to Sarah. "But that doesn't make what I did right. It just makes it slightly less wrong." "So tell the truth," Sarah pressed. Go on record, explain what really happened. You might go to prison, but you won't have to live with the lie anymore. Covington walked back to his desk and sat down heavily. He looked exhausted, like a man who hadn't slept in weeks. "Let me think about it," he said. "That's the best I can do right now." "Okay," Sarah said, "but don't think too long. The military is going to keep pushing their narrative, and eventually people are going to believe it. Eventually, people are going to stop caring about the truth. You need to act while the window is still open." She turned to leave, and then Covington spoke again. "Sarah, I truly am sorry. For what it's worth, I never wanted to hurt you. I wanted to protect the institution. I wanted to make the problem go away. But I never wanted to hurt you personally.